The judge's gavel was suspended in midair. Richard adjusted his bespoke Tom Ford tie, flashing a victory smirk at his 20-something girlfriend in the gallery. He had won. He kept the houses, the company, and the offshore accounts. But then Catherine leaned into her microphone. 3 words changed everything. Room 302 of the Cook County Family Court smelled of lemon polish, stale coffee, and shattered promises. For the past 6 months, it had been the battleground for the dissolution of Richard and Catherine Caldwell's 15-year marriage. But calling it a battleground was generous. A battle implies an even fight. This was a slaughter. Richard Caldwell, the 42-year-old CEO of a wildly lucrative logistics software firm, sat comfortably at the respondent's table. He exuded the relaxed confidence of a man who held all the cards. His dark suit was immaculate, his posture perfectly relaxed. To his right sat Jonathan Pierce, a high-priced divorce attorney known in Chicago's legal circles as the Butcher. Pierce charged $1,000 an hour to financially ruin spouses, and he was worth every penny. Across the aisle sat Catherine. At 39, she looked exhausted. She wore a simple, unbranded navy dress, her dark blonde hair pulled back into a severe clasp. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, fingers white-knuckled around a crumpled tissue. Beside her was Sarah Jenkins, a competent but seemingly outmatched family lawyer who had spent the last 3 days of the trial being systematically bulldozed by Pierce's aggressive litigation tactics. The core of the dispute was a prenuptial agreement signed 15 years ago. Back then, Richard was a struggling developer working out of their cramped 1-bedroom apartment, and Catherine was working double shifts as a registered nurse to pay their rent and keep the lights on. The prenup was supposed to be a formality pushed by Richard's paranoid early investors. It stipulated that in the event of a divorce, Catherine would walk away with a modest lump sum of $250,000, a single vehicle, and exactly zero equity in his company, Apex Solutions. Now, Apex Solutions was valued at over $80 million for 3 days. The courtroom had listened to Jonathan Pierce construct a narrative that painted Catherine as a stagnant, unmotivated partner who had contributed nothing to Richard's empire. Pierce paraded financial experts who testified that Richard's singular genius was the sole driver of the company's wealth. He painted a picture of Catherine living a life of leisure, attending yoga classes and charity luncheons, while Richard broke his back building a legacy. It was a masterful, brutal rewriting of history. Pierce conveniently omitted the years Catherine spent serving as Richard's unpaid secretary, the nights she stayed up reviewing his contracts because they couldn't afford legal counsel, and the thousands of dollars of her nursing salary she had sunk into the company's first server racks. Sitting in the gallery, 2 rows behind Richard, was Jessica Brooks. She was 24, a former marketing assistant at Apex, and Richard's current fiancée. Jessica sat with her legs crossed, ideally checking her phone, occasionally exchanging a sympathetic, mocking look with Richard when Catherine's lawyer fumbled a cross-examination. Jessica had already picked out the interior design for the Aspen Chalet, a property Richard had successfully argued was a corporate asset, completely untouchable in the divorce. Judge Harrison Mitchell, a stern man with 30 years on the bench, sighed heavily as he adjusted his reading glasses. He looked down at the massive stack of paper detailing the Caldwell estate. "Mr. Pierce," Judge Mitchell said, his voice gravelly echoing in the high-ceilinged room, "you have concluded your closing arguments regarding the division of assets. You maintain that the 2011 prenuptial agreement remains binding, and that the defense has failed to prove any commingling of personal and corporate funds that would invalidate it." "That is correct, Your Honor," Pierce stood buttoning his suit jacket. The law is blind to emotional grievances, no matter how much my opposing counsel wishes to rely on them. Mrs. Caldwell signed a legally binding contract. Mr. Caldwell has been more than generous. He has offered to double the alimony stipulated in the prenuptial $500,000 out of the goodness of his heart. We ask that the court honor the agreement and finalize this decree so my client can move on with his life. Richard kept his face passive, but his eyes danced with triumph. $500,000 was pocket change. It was the equivalent of a rounding error in his quarterly tax filings. He had shielded his real wealth, moving tens of millions into offshore trusts and shell companies over the past 3 years in preparation for this exact moment. He had planned his exit from the marriage with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to a corporate merger. Judge Mitchell turned his gaze to Catherine's table. Ms. Jenkins, does the petitioner have anything to add before I render my final judgment? Sarah Jenkins glanced at her client. Catherine's face was unreadable. For months, Catherine had been the picture of a broken woman. She had cried in mediation. She had suffered panic attacks during depositions, and she had begged Richard to be fair for the sake of their history. Richard had consumed her fear like oxygen. It fueled his ego. But right now, in the final hour, Catherine wasn't crying. She nodded just once to her lawyer. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah Jenkins said, standing up. She didn't sound defeated anymore. The nervous tremor in her voice that had been present all week was completely gone. We have one final submission for the court's consideration, a piece of evidence that directly speaks to the validity of the prenuptial agreement and the alleged division of corporate assets. Jonathan Pierce immediately stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Discovery closed 3 weeks ago. Opposing counsel cannot ambush this court with 11th hour evidence. Your Honor, Jenkins countered smoothly. This evidence was only acquired late last night. It is a matter of direct fraud pertaining to the financial disclosures Mr. Caldwell submitted to this very court. Under Rule 60B, evidence of fraud upon the court can be introduced at any time. Judge Mitchell's eyebrows skyrocketed. Fraud upon the court was a massive accusation. Approach the bench, he commanded. The tension in room 302 thickened instantly. Richard leaned forward, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. He whispered harshly to his lawyer. What the hell is she talking about? Pierce, don't panic, Pierce muttered out of the side of his mouth, not breaking eye contact with the judge. It's a desperate Hail Mary, a scare tactic. They have nothing. At the judge's bench, Sarah Jenkins handed over a thick manila envelope. Your Honor, yesterday evening we received a verified, certified ledger from the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority alongside corresponding internal emails from Apex Solutions. It concerns a holding company named Blackwood Logistics. Back at the respondent's table, Richard Caldwell felt a drop of cold sweat trace a line down his spine. Blackwood Logistics. How did she know that name? Blackwood was his ghost ship. It was a dummy corporation set up by a shady wealth manager 3 years ago. Richard had been bleeding Apex Solutions for 36 months, funneling high-value intellectual property patents and millions in consulting fees directly into Blackwood. Legally on paper, Apex looked like it was plateauing, justifying the $80 million valuation he presented to the court. But the real meat of his empire, the next-generation AI algorithms that were about to be acquired by a major defense contractor for nearly $400 million, belonged entirely to Blackwood. And nobody, absolutely nobody, knew about Blackwood except him and his offshore broker. This documentation, Jenkins continued, speaking loud enough for the microphone to pick up her words and broadcast them through the courtroom, demonstrates that Mr. Caldwell deliberately committed perjury on his sworn financial affidavits. He concealed assets totaling an estimated $350 million. The gallery erupted into furious whispers. Jessica Brooks stopped looking at her phone, her jaw dropping open as she stared at the back of Richard's head. $350 million? Order. Judge Mitchell slammed his gavel. He ripped open the envelope and began scanning the documents. The color slowly drained from his face. Mr. Pierce, the judge said, his voice dangerously low. Are you aware of an entity known as Blackwood Logistics? Pierce was a professional. He didn't sweat, but his eyes darted nervously. Your Honor, I have no knowledge of this entity, nor can we verify the authenticity of these supposedly certified documents brought in at the final hour. They bear the official seal of the Cayman Registry, Judge Mitchell snapped, holding up a page, and they include wire transfer receipts, directly matching outgoing funds from Apex Solutions, funds that your client claimed under oath were lost to server depreciation and R&D failures. Your Honor, we need time to review this. Pierce scrambled, his aggressive swagger entirely evaporated. This is a gross violation of procedure. What a gross violation, the judge. Clear's throat, interrupted, his voice booming, is lying to my face 3 days straight. If these documents are authentic, your client hasn't just voided his prenuptial agreement through fraudulent non-disclosure. He has committed a federal crime. Richard's hands were shaking. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, trying to ground himself. He stared at Catherine. She was looking right back at him. Clear's throat. The tired, broken woman from the past 6 months was gone. Her posture was straight. Her eyes, usually warm and soft, were locked onto his with the cold, absolute, zero precision of a sniper. A faint, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile touched the corner of her lips. She played me. Richard realized with a sudden, suffocating horror. She played me this entire time. All the crying, the panic attacks, the begging. It was a performance. She had let him build his arrogant, bulletproof defense. She had let Pierce parade his witnesses and drag her name through the mud. She had let him feel entirely victorious, knowing full well that she was holding a tactical nuclear weapon under the table, waiting for the exact moment he committed himself fully to his lies on the permanent legal record. Ms. Jenkins, Judge Mitchell said, leaning over the bench, these documents show that Blackwood Logistics was incorporated in 2023, but the ownership structure here is highly complex. It lists a blind trust as the primary shareholder. That is correct, Your Honor, Jenkins said calmly. Can you identify the beneficiary of this blind trust? The judge asked. Richard held his breath. He knew the beneficiary. It was him. Clear's throat. He had signed the paperwork through a proxy. Once they proved he was the beneficiary, he would lose half of it to Catherine and likely face prison time for perjury and tax evasion. It was a disaster. His life was over. But Catherine's lawyer shook her head. No, Your Honor. Mr. Caldwell is not the beneficiary. Richard blinked. The entire courtroom went dead silent. Even the judge looked confused. I'm sorry, counsel. If Mr. Caldwell didn't set up this offshore account to hide his own assets, then who did? Sarah Jenkins turned slowly, looking down at Richard with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. Mr. Caldwell believed he was setting it up for himself, Your Honor. Jenkins explained, her voice ringing clear through the silent room. 3 years ago, Mr. Caldwell hired a third-party wealth management firm to establish the Blackwood Shell Company. He communicated with them entirely via encrypted email using a proxy agent to sign the final deeds to ensure his name was nowhere on the founding documents. Jenkins paused, letting the silence stretch out, suffocating the respondents' table. What Mr. Caldwell did not realize Jenkins continued softly, was that the proxy agent he hired online was actually a private investigator, retained by my client. Mrs. Caldwell discovered his plans to hide assets 3 years ago. Richard's blood ran completely cold. His lungs stopped working. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped his throat. When the final documents for the blind trust were drafted, Jenkins said, turning to face Richard directly. The private investigator followed Mr. Caldwell's instructions to the letter, except for one minor detail. He didn't put Richard Caldwell's name down as the beneficiary of the trust. Then whose name is on it? Judge Mitchell asked, leaning forward, utterly captivated. Catherine finally broke her silence. She leaned forward to her microphone, her voice steady, cool, and devastatingly calm. Mine, Your Honor. The silence in room 302 was absolute, heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that follows a catastrophic car crash right before the screaming begins. Richard Caldwell stared at his soon-to-be ex-wife, his vision blurring at the edges. The bespoke Tom Ford tie that had felt like a sash of victory 20 minutes ago now felt like a hangman's noose. He loosened it with a trembling hand, his breathing shallow and erratic. Yours, Jonathan Pierce, the formidable butcher of Chicago's family courts, finally broke the silence. His voice was a pathetic, reedy squeak, completely stripped of its usual booming authority. That is impossible. That is theft. That is wire fraud. Careful, Mr. Pierce. Judge Mitchell warned, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. You're treading on incredibly thin ice. Ms. Jenkins, you have the floor. Explain exactly what I am looking at. Sarah Jenkins stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the center of the courtroom. 3 years ago, Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Caldwell, noticed discrepancies in the household accounting. Mr. Caldwell had always been secretive about Apex Solutions' finances, but she noticed substantial, unexplained lifestyle cutbacks despite public announcements of massive corporate growth. Catherine sat perfectly still, her hands no longer clutching the tissue. They rested calmly on the mahogany table. Mrs. Caldwell found an old, discarded iPad in their basement that was still logged into Mr. Caldwell's secondary iCloud account. Jenkins continued. There, she found the initial encrypted email drafts sent to Sovereign Wealth Partners, an offshore advisory firm in Geneva, Switzerland. She read his step-by-step plans to deliberately devalue Apex Solutions and siphon the intellectual property into a shadow corporation to shield it from an impending divorce. In the gallery, Jessica Brooks let out a loud, involuntary gasp. Richard flinched, not daring to look back at his young fiancée. Instead of confronting him, Jenkins explained, her voice echoing with steady authority. Mrs. Caldwell hired Thomas Gallagher, a former investigator for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, now operating a private intelligence firm right here in Chicago. Mr. Gallagher specialized in tracking offshore tax evasion. This is an ambush. Pierce slammed his hand on the table, desperate to regain control of a narrative that had entirely escaped him. Your Honor, this is an illegal sting operation. If she diverted his funds, she committed grand larceny. They were marital funds, Mr. Pierce. Judge Mitchell snapped, pointing his gavel like a weapon at the defense table. And your client was actively attempting to conceal them from this court. Sit down and shut up. I want to hear the rest of this. Pierce sat. He looked physically ill. Thank you, Your Honor. Jenkins nodded. Mr. Gallagher set up a digital honeypot, knowing Mr. Caldwell needed an anonymous dark web proxy to act as the legal signatory for the Cayman Islands Trust, to ensure his own name was utterly scrubbed from the paper trail. Mr. Gallagher's team posed as a boutique offshore proxy service called Horizon Fiduciary. Mr. Caldwell found their strategically placed advertisements on the encrypted forums he frequented. Richard felt the blood drain entirely from his face. He remembered Horizon Fiduciary. He had vetted them. He had paid them a massive retainer in cryptocurrency. They had been professional, discreet, and ruthless. They had been Catherine. Mr. Caldwell communicated his wishes. Perfectly, Jenkins said, holding up the stack of printed, decrypted emails. He ordered the proxy to establish Blackwood Logistics. He ordered the proxy to act as the sole director, and he ordered the proxy to assign a blind trust as the ultimate beneficiary. The only thing the proxy changed, Your Honor, was the name on the beneficiary designation form. Judge Mitchell leaned back in his leather chair, a look of profound astonishment and begrudging respect washing over his stern features. So, when Mr. Caldwell transferred $350 million worth of patents, algorithms, and liquid cash into Blackwood Logistics over the last 36 months, he was legally, and irrevocably transferring it directly into a trust, wholly owned by Catherine Caldwell. Jenkins finished with a definitive nod. We had an independent audit conducted last month by Grant Thornton to verify the chain of custody of every single penny. It's all in the brief. Richard shot out of his chair. You, he screamed, the polished, arrogant CEO facade shattering into a million pieces. You stole my company. You stole my life's work. I built that code. I built Apex. Bailiff, Judge Mitchell roared, slamming his gavel with the force of a gunshot. One more outburst like that, Mr. Caldwell, and you will spend the rest of this divorce proceeding in a holding cell for contempt. Sit down. Richard collapsed into his chair, panting heavily. The walls of the courtroom felt like they were closing in. He looked at Jonathan Pierce, expecting his high-priced shark to deploy some brilliant, brutal countermeasure. But Pierce was actively scooting his chair away from Richard. In the legal world, there's a very strict line between aggressive advocacy and becoming an accessory to a federal crime. Jonathan Pierce had built his career dancing on that line. But looking at the Grant Thornton forensic audit lying on the judge's bench, he knew Richard Caldwell had just dragged him over the cliff. Your Honor. Pierce stood up. His voice was shaking. He wasn't looking at Richard. He was looking strictly at the judge. I would like to state for the permanent, an official record that my firm, Pierce and Associates, had absolutely zero knowledge of Blackwood Logistics, these offshore accounts, or the perjury committed on the financial affidavits submitted to this court. Richard whipped his head around, staring at his lawyer in betrayal. Jonathan, what are you doing? I am saving my law license. Richard, Pierce hissed venomously under his breath. He turned back to the bench. Your Honor, given the sudden introduction of this evidence and the severe implications of fraud perpetrated by my own client, I find myself in an untenable ethical position. I must formally request to withdraw as counsel for the respondent, effective immediately. The courtroom buzzed with shock. A lawyer abandoning their client in the final hour of closing arguments was virtually unheard of. It was the ultimate declaration of legal death. Request noted, Mr. Pierce, but denied for the moment. Judge Mitchell said coldly, you will sit there until I deliver my ruling. I'm not delaying this trial another day to let Mr. Caldwell find new counsel to lie to. In the gallery, the sharp, distinct sound of high heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoed through the room. Everyone turned. Jessica Brooks had stood up. Her face was pale. She looked from Richard, now sweating profusely, abandoned by his lawyer and facing total ruin, Clear's throat, to Catherine, who sat with the serene calm of a queen who had just checkmated her opponent. Jessica didn't say a word. She simply picked up her designer handbag, turned on her heel, and walked out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind her with a definitive thud. The Aspen Chalet was gone. The private jets were gone. The $80 million tech genius she thought she was marrying was about to be a broke Felon. Richard watched the doors close, his jaw trembling. He was entirely, utterly alone. Judge Mitchell adjusted his glasses and looked down at the documents, then over to Catherine. Mrs. Caldwell, the judge said, his voice surprisingly gentle. For the past 3 days, I have sat here and listened to opposing counsel paint you as a lazy, opportunistic spouse who contributed nothing to this marriage. I have watched you endure a barrage of insults regarding your intelligence and your worth. Catherine looked up at the judge, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. But this time, they were tears of relief, not terror. It takes an extraordinary amount of fortitude to sit silently under that kind of abuse. Judge Mitchell continued, his voice echoing in the silent room, knowing exactly what you held in your hand. You did not just uncover a fraud. You meticulously dismantled it. The judge turned his attention to Richard, and the gentleness vanished, replaced by a terrifying righteous wrath. Mr. Caldwell, you sat in my courtroom under oath and swore that your financial disclosures were complete and accurate. You attempted to use the legal system as a weapon to financially starve the woman who supported you when you were nothing. You drafted a prenuptial agreement designed to leave her with scraps. And when even that wasn't enough for your greed, you orchestrated a massive, illegal scheme to hide $350 million. Judge Mitchell picked up his pen. I am officially ruling that the 2011 prenuptial agreement is null and void, invalidated by extreme, documented, and egregious financial fraud on the part of the respondent. Richard buried his face in his hands. Furthermore, the judge continued, writing furiously on the decree regarding the division of assets. Since you so brilliantly engineered the transfer of Apex Solutions' core assets into the Blackwood Trust, I am affirming that the trust and the $350 million within it is the sole and separate property of the legal beneficiary, Catherine Caldwell. Sarah Jenkins smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Catherine's shoulder. As for the remaining depleted shell of Apex Solutions, Judge Mitchell declared, I am awarding 60% of all remaining shares, equity, and liquid capital to the petitioner, Mrs. Caldwell, as punitive compensation for the respondent's attempt to defraud the marital estate. You, Mr. Caldwell, may keep the remaining 40%, as well as the debt you incurred to fund your offshore misadventures. Richard let out a hollow, broken sound. He had started the week worth nearly $400 million. He was walking out with a fraction of a dying company and millions in legal and tax liabilities. Finally, Judge Mitchell said, gathering the Grant Thornton audit and the decrypted emails, I'm unsealing these exhibits. A copy of this transcript, along with all evidence of Blackwood Logistics, is being forwarded directly to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. You try to play a very dangerous game with federal tax laws, Mr. Caldwell. I highly suggest you use your remaining 40% of that company to hire a very good criminal defense attorney. Judge Mitchell picked up his gavel. He looked at Catherine one last time and offered a curt, respectful nod. This court is adjourned. The gavel slammed down, the sound ringing out like a final definitive period at the end of a 15-year sentence. Catherine stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her simple navy dress. She didn't gloat. She didn't look at Richard as he sat, paralyzed at the defense table, his life reduced to ashes. She simply picked up her purse, thanked Sarah Jenkins, and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the crisp Chicago air, breathing freely for the first time in 3 years. She had played the long game, and she had won everything. One incredible reminder that the truth always finds a way to the surface. Richard thought he could outsmart the system, but Catherine's brilliant 3-year sting operation proved that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned and financially betrayed. If you were left speechless by Catherine's ultimate revenge, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more crazy real-life drama.